Disunited Nations is about what happens when major powers decide they are better off competing instead of cooperating. It is a book about what happens when the global order isn't just falling apart, but when many leaders feel their country will be better off tearing it down. We're going to look at the rise of Trump and leaders like him. We're going to think through Saudi Arabia and Iran's competition to rule or misrule the Middle East. We're going to look at how we match farmers to hungry mouths, minerals to manufacturing, oil to gas tanks. Through these stories, we're going to keep two big ideas in mind. The first is that geography might not be destiny, but it is damn close. It is the biggest factor in determining how we act and how we live and fundamentally who we are. Live in a desert and bam, you're going to fight to protect what little you have. Live on a coast and bam, you're going to eat a lot of foreign food. Live in a dense urban area and bam, you're probably not going to have an issue with Tongans, Thais, Tunisians, or transvestites. Live in the mountains and bam, you're going to be a bit persnickety when folks from other regions roll through. As we were geographers at heart, in this Matt and I were in complete agreement. Most of us consistently misread economies and conflicts because we don't take geography into account. It's so clear that we are not like the next town over, and city folk are not like country folk, but when we start trying to explain the world, geography often slips our mind. We misinterpret what's happening in the news and think China is holding on to Hong Kong out of stubbornness, or the fights about the American-Mexican border are only about race. Geography shapes everything, including us. What's been different in recent decades is that geography has been suspended somewhat, enabling deep global economic interconnections. We've come to see those connections as a great strength. That moment of transition when the order will come crashing down is almost upon us. It may not seem this way to Americans who have been engaged in some degree of warfare continuously since 1999 and had decades of duck and cover drills before that. But the world since 1946 is as calm as the world has ever been. In creating their anti-Soviet Cold War alliance, the Americans by hook, crook, carrot, and stick brought every significant power of the past 5 centuries together under a single banner. Norway, Sweden, Spain, Portugal, France, Germany, the Netherlands, Italy, Greece, Turkey, Iran, Japan, China, all of them and more allied in various degrees of formality against the Soviet Union. If they were to be fighting the Soviets, it wouldn't be particularly productive if they were also fighting one another. The American alliance didn't so much end history as freeze it in place. Most Americans are broadly familiar with the European side of the equation. After centuries of conflict within the continent, the guns fell nearly silent, courtesy of the American security system. But the impact on Asia was even bigger. China and India did not have a single century in the past 2 millennia when they were not at war with themselves or under assault from a foreign power. Instead, from the American-enforced end of British colonial rule in India in the late 1940s, and China's joining of the American-led alliance against the Soviets in the 1970s, the two have had the most security and wealth in their long histories. As the decades rolled on, the Soviets ran out of gas. The American network expanded deep into the non-aligned countries of the developing world and the former Soviet Empire. But the Americans never adapted their overall strategies to a post-Cold War world, and so never built a case at home or abroad for their alliance in a world without the Soviet Union. It turns out, both to the detriment of Matt's and my own pet theories, the 1990s and the 2000s were less a moment of transition and more a world on autopilot, with an old security strategy enabling some gangbusters growth. That gangbusters growth is what most of us think of as normal. It is not. It is nothing more than a moment in time made possible by some strategic inertia. But now Matt's suitable motivation is over. The Americans have changed their mind about their alliance and have turned sharply more insular. There is no effort to ride herd. The W. Bush administration abused the Allies. The Obama administration ignored the Allies, and the Trump administration insulted the Allies. And so America's list of allies has shrunk from nearly everyone to the potentially useful, to the obviously useful, to the obviously loyal, to those with little choice. In a world without America, the questions become, who will still benefit from some lingering connection to the Americans? And who can go it alone? My transformational boom is over as well. Without the global security the Americans guaranteed, global trade and global energy flows cannot continue. 7 decades worth of global industrialization and modernization are not simply at risk, the very pillars of civilization are cracking. In a world without stability, the questions become, who was most dependent upon the world that was and so will fall? And who was most restrained by the old order and so will soar? The world we know is collapsing. Entire countries are watching in horror as what makes them possible, global access, imported energy, foreign markets, American troops, slips through their fingers. For many, there just isn't enough access or energy or markets or security for them to maintain what they have, much less grow. In a world of want, the questions become, what do countries need to survive in a scrambled world? Who will shoot to get what they need? And who gets shot at? Not all competitions and scarcities are created equal. Nearly all food is dependent upon global trade, whether in the form of imported inputs or the foodstuffs themselves. For decades, the world's experiences with famine have been crises of distribution, the inability to match foods with mouths. Global breakdown guts food supply itself. The security concerns of the past 2 decades were largely limited to terrorism. But the tools necessary to counter terror are radically different from those needed to protect agricultural supply chains. Fewer door-to-door manhunts, more beyond-the-horizon naval patrols. In a world of different scarcities and different tools, the questions become, where will trade patterns hold and where will they collapse? Which ones are worth fighting over? Which tools will be brought to bear? Are we on the verge of a mess of overlapping and interlocking naval competitions for something as basic as the right to eat? Both Matt and I were wrong, and for the same reasons. We both suffered from a failure of imagination, believing in our respective simplistic visions that the world of tomorrow would be some variation of the world we knew. The break is sharper. We stand at the end of the era that began with the Cold War. It'll be less like the messiness of the early 2000s or the raw potential of the 1950s, and more a disastrous combination of the battle royales and displacements of the 1870s against the economic backdrop of the 1930s. It will suck. A mad scramble for the scraps of the era just ending. Compared with the safety and wealth of the past several decades, it may seem like the literal end of the world. But the end of an era isn't the same as the end of history. Something new is coming. Something that, historically speaking, is far more normal than anything the Americans created. Just keep in mind that normal is far from synonymous with comfortable, much less favorable. Disunited Nations is my effort to sketch out that normal future, to answer these questions and more, to identify the countries that will rise to dominate the human condition and perhaps provide a glimpse as to what that condition will be, both in the time during and after this moment of transition. In the pages that follow, I'm going to argue that thinking the future will look more like the year 2000 than the year 1900 has negative effects in almost every sphere of our lives. On a grand scale, many of us are betting on the wrong horses. France will lead the new Europe, not Germany. We should be worried about Saudi Arabia, not Iran. We should be thinking about how to remedy mass starvation in China, not counter its military and economic clout. As we look at how each country has benefited from the order and what each brings to the table in a new world, these conclusions will seem obvious, rather than controversial. In chapters 1 through 4, we'll take a whirlwind tour of the past and present, the various epochs of history, combined with a quick and dirty review of how to run a global empire and what makes countries tick. Chapters 5 through 13 are dedicated to the major powers,